Namaste and welcome to one and all. I am Lavanya Gadodia, Director Legal at Dharma In Real-Time, a new organization which seeks to introduce itself through this podcast. And I'm joined here by my friends and colleagues, Mr. Rakshit Rajesh, Vikram Rohan Iyer, Varun Agrawal, as well as Akash Jaiswal. Before I move on to introducing each of them, I'm an advocate and a litigator practicing before the Honorable Jharkhand High Court at Ranchi. Apart from my career as a litigator, I am a trained Kathak dancer who has a keen interest in pursuing Indic legal reform. Rakshit Rajesh is the chair of this esteemed organization, who is also an advocate and who holds a master's degree in intellectual property laws from the University of California at Berkeley. Apart from his career as a IP lawyer, he is a student of the Indic and decolonial studies with a particular interest in Shastras, Puranas, as well as the Vedantic tradition. Might I say that he's an amazing player of the Saraswati Veena. A very warm welcome to my friend, Mr. Rakshit Rajesh. Moving on, Mr. Co-Chair Vikram Rohan Iyer is also an advocate, and he's currently pursuing Masters in Psychology. It might seem a shift, but it is a very well-intentioned and strategic move. And he aims to use his multidisciplinary exposure in reforming the existing counseling practices by bringing in a more humanistic perspective derived from the Dharmic traditions. He's a classically trained Carnatic musician, and he has a keen interest in the various spiritual traditions of Dharmic civilization with an emphasis on meditative practices. Mr. Akash Jaiswal, Director Operational Strategy, is also an advocate, and he, with his participation in the organization and through his contributions, he aims to increase awareness, and he also seeks to assist the Indian society overcome its histrionic condition with respect to the value systems and the cultural dogmas which have been picked up due to centuries of colonization and unjust conquest. Lastly, Mr. Varun Agarwal, Director Media Affairs, quite literally the man behind the camera and the magician behind it all. Welcome to one and all, and let the discussions begin. With the introduction, I would now like to move on to what Dharma in real time essentially means and stands for. The question is open to all my friends, and I welcome a response which might help the audience understanding the true nature of the organization, what it seeks to do, preach, raise awareness about, and what is its aims and objectives in terms of what it seeks to see in the society, what changes it seeks to see in the society, what it seeks to bring to the society, and so on and so forth. So a question to either the chair or the co-chair, please. Might I have your answers?
Chair, you want to go first?
Sure. So, as we all know, we sort of live in a time where a lot of, let's say, the Indian current societal ethos or the diaspora are staunch followers in Western thought, philosophically or sociopolitically. And while Western thought definitely has its place, in terms of a progressive tenet, I feel like the contours of a nation state, which is, let's say, the civilizational, or rather the socio-political ethos that is purported by the left, by the left and the West in general, is sort of very limiting when it comes to India's 7,000 historical narratives, stories. We have actually been the most significantly surviving civilization through a history of conquest and invasions. And Dharma in Real-Time basically seeks not to revert us to, let's say, an archaic notion or idea of dharmic causes and intuitions, but a more, let's say, a noble middle path that is sort of be struck between modernity or contemporariness and dharmic roots that we seem to have forgotten. That's essentially what the essence of our organization is. We do this by way of, let's say, legal reform, or by way of academia, by way of intellectual discourse, podcasts such as these, and the essential sort of modicum, or the essential practice that we're trying to espouse here is of an activist kind, and aims at furthering, let's say, knowledge and education of Indic civilization and India's or Bharat's past in general.
Yeah, that was wonderful, Rakshit. So I'd like to take over from here. As I was introduced earlier, I'm the co-chair, Vikram. And the way I see this organization is from a multifold perspective, in the sense that I believe that no single enterprise, such as just academia or just legal reform or just a podcast, which is mainly just outreach and awareness, I believe that none of these three individual elements can by themselves create any form of significant change to the extent that India needs it. In the sense that we have been battered and bruised quite often, like by not only invaders but also post-independence, where we've seen various attacks upon Indian civilization and culture. We've also seen a systematic dismantling of whatever was left when the colonizers left, whatever little was left of our individual Indic traditions, and also of our knowledge systems, and also of our epistemological perspectives in terms of how we judge a piece of literature or a piece of academia to be a legitimate and to be a source of authority. The very basis on which this notion is decided itself was determined by the West, which essentially means that India and Indic scholars and the people in general, as a consequence, have lost the very ability to decide for themselves what exactly is the narrative that they want to situate for themselves as a country and as an ancient civilization. But rather, we are forced to look upon the same through a Western lens, through the interpretation of Western scholars, through the epistemology of the West, which seeks to conveniently pigeonhole India into their ideas and into their perspectives of what counts as a civilized country. Although they have moved on from such terminologies in the present, their intentions are quite obvious, in the sense that they believe in the supremacy of the liberal order, and also the dilution and eventual eradication of any surviving real living signs of Indian tradition. What they would rather prefer to see is a museum Hinduism, or like a very antiquated idea that, that Hinduism is only of a certain sort. For example, this thing where we hear where Hinduism is all about peace and all about acceptance, and it is all about that forever. So this is the version of Hinduism that the West is interested to see and also interested to propagate. Which is why quite often when we see any attempt by Hindu society or the Hindu intelligentsia to organize in any coherent fashion, it is often met with quite an unjustified reaction and quite a widespread resistance from various sources in the world, which is quite in contrast to what we see in terms of decolonization efforts, which are being propagated by other ethnic groups. We do not see the same resistance as we see with India and Indian traditions. So this, I would largely say, is a consequence of Indians themselves not having a civilizational consciousness and not having a consciousness which is capable of interpreting their own texts, but are rather fed the information from outside sources, and therefore develop a certain deeply ingrained subconscious inferiority complex, which makes them understand anything that is Western as inherently superior. Therefore, the aim of the organization, in my opinion, is to adopt a multi-pronged approach through academia, through spreading awareness, and also through legal reform, which is creating change at the realistic level, to use all of these methods to wake the Indian consciousness up, to wake the dharmic consciousness up and understand our civilizational role, which has a lot to do with our ancient history, which has gone in a very clear continuation, and also in opposition to attempts by Western scholars and also from quite a few Indian scholars who are trained in the Western tradition in pigeonholing the various traditions of India, in separating them as individual bits and not seeing them as part of a total cultural whole, but rather separating them into individual bits and pieces. Like, for example, what has been done with the dharmic religions of Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, and also Sikhism, which have been clearly delineated and designated as separate traditions which have very little to do with one another, when exactly the opposite is true. When any practicing member of any spiritual tradition in India will be able to tell you that these traditions are all in continuation with one another, and they all have certain basic elements in common, which are very clearly indicative of a collective civilizational past, all of which is being denied and actively, and any contrary evidence is being suppressed by scholars, or Indian scholars and Western scholars, who have a very, very poor and unnuanced understanding at best, and a completely vitriolic and almost evil intentions at worst. So our organization simply aims to combat this at multiple levels and create awareness and awakening in the Indian consciousness as to who we are as people and how we can define our identity. And we do this through a conversational basis. And whatever results we reach as a result of our conversations, we pursue the same in terms of legal reform and in terms of academia. That's all from me. Thank you.
Very well said, Mr. Co-Chair. I think the chair wants to add on to something that you said. Passing you the mic, Rakshit.
Thank you, Lavanya. So, as Vikram actually pointed out, in fact, in my opening remarks, one theme that I may have skipped my attention is that of this colonial hangover that we have been experiencing as a civilization. When I say colonial hangover, I don't mean it in the explicit sense of we have the white sahib still down our backs at this very moment. I mean that the essence of the white sahib's, let's say, his practice or his message or his modus operandi that was employed in shackling us for a good part of 200 years, and prior to that, by, let's say, the other invasion, the invading, let's say, elements of society. We have been a society that has been lauded across the world for being very tolerant. But what many of us, not just the external agents, but many of us internally as well as citizens, we forget that the proverbial, in a sense, of ahimsa dharma, paramo dharma is actually a very incomplete proverb in practice and in theory, where we believe that there's some sort of a Martin Luther King or a Gandhian extortion of our tolerance to even agents that are vehemently and explicitly intolerant to us. So a big aim of the organization is some way re-engineering the way we perceive our own faith systems, our own value systems, and above all, the Bharatiyata that is in us, for lack of a better word. When I say this, I mean in the way we express our words through language, through shabda, through word, through linguistics, through epistemologies, be that as it may. I'll give you a quick example. There's a very famous, let's say, there's conflation between the words atheist and Gnostic. Very little of us know that Gnostic does not translate to atheist. In fact, Gnostic, under the Sanatani Dharma traditions, actually means those that do not believe that the Veda is the final authority or the supreme authority, is the pramana, for lack of a better word. It is often conflated to mean the English equivalent of atheist, which is not. The same thing is with priest and purohit, for instance. These conflations or these misconceptions aren't just damaging, let's say, on paper in an expressive capacity, but because Sanskrit as a language or our traditions are loaded with contextual as well as conceptual ideas, such loose, let's say, conversions or translations do great injustice to our cause as a civilization. So I think that Dharma in Real-Time also focuses on re-educating the masses and, let's say, intellectual stalwarts alike in perceiving the world through without like the rose-tinted glasses of colonialism. So I'm very, very confident that to this effect, a lot of what Vikram was expressing is vehemently important or essential in sort of reaching or retaining a sense of cultural and spiritual identity that we have seemed to have lost over the years.
Moving on from what I gather, Vikram stated that we have sort of forgotten that we have a collective past, that we have experienced certain things as a whole, as a unit, as a community. I remembered someone told me a few days ago that the Jews never let anybody forget the Holocaust, right? They never let anybody forget that they as a community suffered at the hands of the Nazis. But when the Hindus, when they seek to talk about their sufferings, the conquests that they have had to face, the invasions that they have survived and suffered from, those conversations at the most, in the most subtle manner, if I put it, are given an unwelcomed reaction at the hands of the liberals, for the lack of a better word, and which is also contributive to how the Hindus how the Hindus' consciousness as a unit might be awakened. Because as we know, history unifies us as well, right? Like, I mean, history unifies everybody, not just the present. The history needs to be revived, needs to be reiterated for the community to feel that they have suffered as one, they have lived as one in the past, and they can do so together today as well. So what is the organization's take on that? And from that, I would like to ask, what is the relevance of the organization in this aspect in today's societal ethos? Why I say societal ethos is because when we bring up such conversations, it is when I say it's unwelcome, it is unwelcome because it is posed as if we are ethically against another community, right? We are posed against each other, which is not true, right? I mean, we're today as well, we're not against the Germans. Nobody blames the Germans, we blame the Nazis. Those are a particular group of people. Similarly, today, if the Hindus are Hindus talk about their sufferings at the hands of a Mughal emperor, they're not talking about the Muslims in general. They're talking about that particular group of people. So why is that one is given, when the Jews talk about the Holocaust, that is given more importance, or that conversation is more welcome than a conversation that a Hindu tries to initiate against a Mughal invasion? An open question again to either of the panelists.
If nobody wants to answer that, I would like to go for it. What do you think, Lakshit?
Just before you answer, maybe 30 seconds, I would just like to answer in the sense, in fact, I would try to bring the attention in terms of illustration of your point, Lavanya, in terms of another, let's say, the idea of genocide itself seems to escape, or seems to be something of a luxury exclusive to other communities apart from Hindu communities. We have seen this with the Kashmir genocide. We see this with the Mopla rebellion, 1921, or I would more correctly call it as genocide of 1921. And we also see such, let's say, oppressive tactics in terms of temple control by state governments, which they would not dare to do with the other religious communities in India. So I think while Vikram, I would leave it to him to sort of go into the meat of the issue, so to speak. I think that we have, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, been a punching bag for far too long in a lot of areas and domains.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said, Rakshit. Just like to add a little bit more to that. I would like to add a few more elements and then pass the torch to my friend Jaiswal, Akash Jaiswal, who will have much more to add to this, I'm sure. But what I want to say very particularly is the reason as to why often the various atrocities which have historically been committed upon Hindus are largely swept under the carpet or do not have enough visibility on the global stage, despite the fact that vast millions of Hindus, uncounted number of the Hindu people have been butchered under various waves of colonization, is mainly because the West only looks upon itself as the center of all narratives that occur in history in quite a funny manner, because it's almost that when there is a genocide or any kind of atrocity that is committed by the Europeans upon a non-European race or a people, it is simply construed as, oh, look, we did this, now we are going to remedy it. So that doesn't, while it may seem at the face of it to be well-intentioned, all it conveys is this Eurocentric mindset that is very, very obviously visible in the academic circles of the West, and also in these intellectual cliques which have formed in India at various universities, private and public. What I would also like to point out is that the history of colonization in India, generally when the West studies colonization, and by the way, I would like to make it very clear that whatever we know or study about colonization today is largely from the Western lens, like in the sense that a decolonized perspective has still not fully taken root in India, and there's many debates as to what that actually means. But that being said, the colonization of India does not really begin with the British takeover of the country post the defeat of Mir Jafar in Bengal. Like we actually see the history of colonization in India begin post the 10th century with the Arab and the Muslim invasions which have occurred, like in India, which largely led to the very first weakenings of Hindu society and the chain links of defense and culture which have been carefully built up over centuries and millennia, and the systematic destruction of various Hindu texts and schools of thought, and also the entire cultural tradition of passing on the knowledge, all of which were systematically destroyed and with an intention to subjugate the people. All of this today, according to the UN, UNHRC, all of this classifies as genocidal behavior, destruction of cultural knowledge, large-scale conversion, elimination of certain religious practices, discriminatory practices which are intended to inconvenience the people of the land with an intention to making them convert, or with an intention to changing their mindset to a completely different tradition, all of which took place first in a very brutal form under the Islamic conquests at various periods, and in a much more manipulative and a cunning way under the British, where they realized that open aggression is simply creating resistance. Therefore, we will simply change the entire education system itself. So we make the Indians believe that whatever is coming from their tradition is wrong and is barbaric, and whatever is coming from our tradition is actually enlightened and is actually valuable. And therefore, this mindset and the same education policy which has been pursued by successive governments in independent India until I'm sorry to say until even today, despite the fact that we have a much more so-called indigenous government in place now, despite that fact, largely our education systems remain under the yoke of the British and under the chains of our deep history of British colonization, and also what this kind of education has brought into place is a complete denial of the atrocities and the centuries of shame and destruction that India faced at the hands of its previous colonizers, who were Arab and Turkic in nature, in the interest of preserving a false idea of unity and friendship, which can actually really be created through reconciliation committees and by acknowledging history, where instead of creating true respect and true understanding between various communities who have had historical differences, successive governments in India have pursued the policy of selectively removing historical facts and creating a false narrative of harmony and of integration, when in reality most of the real situations which were happening were ones of conflict and of civilizational struggle, not only on the battlefield but also ideologically and philosophically. These are all very, very complicated and in-depth themes which in any other part of the world concerning the colonization of any other people, for example the South American people, are examined and explored with very, very careful and very, very systematic approaches of academia. While in the case of India, all we see here are completely Marxist individuals. I have no problem with saying this. Are Marxist individuals who have taken the Western school of thought to a complete ideological extreme, and shamefully so, this is propagated by Indians who have somehow developed a false consciousness that they are in fact the members of a benighted race who are capable of no knowledge or of no progress, and that everything we have had here is backward. And they are perpetuating this absolute nonsense of the highest order as academic truth, based on the citations and based on the epistemology which is derived from citing works and from and academic literature which was originally compiled by British colonialists to justify the colonization of India through a deliberate mistranslation of Sanskrit texts and a deliberate misrepresentation of Indian cultural traditions. So therefore, this is a very, very complicated and multi-layered kind of problem which we need to extricate, which nobody is talking about. And nobody is funding, and not many people are funding, like the government, neither is the government funding any kind of research into this, contrary to popular trends everywhere else in the world in terms of the decolonization movement. The exact opposite is occurring in India. Therefore, it is our view that only private and independent organizations run by truly well-intentioned individuals, only these organizations are capable of creating real change. And we are seeing the same occur by very obviously by the fact that there are a lot of Indic organizations which have sprung up over the last few years, a lot of Indic research centers, and a lot of Indic scholars who have been very, very outspoken in bringing about the awareness. We would simply like to follow in their footsteps and also go ahead and approach this from our own unique perspective as well, of action and of deliberate and calculated progress, and also not falling off the edge into false notions of what Hinduism is, which have crept in as a result of Hindus becoming overly conservative. We want to make sure that we stay away from that problem as well. We want to go back to the original intentions of Hinduism and the original free-minded, self-exploratory aspect of Hinduism, and the spiritual and humanistic and humanitarian universalistic concepts which inspired our civilization and shaped every aspect of our daily life in ancient times, and also until very recently, until a few hundred years ago. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you, Rakshit. My next question is actually to Akash Jaiswal. While we were chatting about the podcast and the aims and objectives of the organization, he cautioned me, and rightly so, from avoiding any conversation which probably might lead to us praising the Vedantic traditions to an extent that everything modern is rejected. uh what Vikram said right now, that we have to stir clear from the problem that the Hindus become too conservative as well, not just conservative in terms of the general understanding of it, but conservative in terms of too protective of what their past was or is. So what is the reason why, Akash, you want us to steer clear of that problem? What are its implications and how you intend to do it is my question to you. Handing over the mic to you. Thank you.
Fine. See, essentially, there's a certain tendency which I've noticed in a lot of speakers who cater to the dharmic views. They tend to focus too much on the past, which gives an idea to people that Vedas and our traditions are relevant only with respect to our past glorious history. But that's not true, because the kind of techniques we have, the kind of values that we preach are very modern. They are very relevant as to the rules that are in place today. Now, if you really think about it, a lot of our culture, if you change the name, you find that you find our practices being practiced all across the globe in different countries, in different cultures. They may not identify themselves as Hindus, but essentially we are all across the globe. Now, why I wanted to caution against it is I don't want our community to become a xenophobic, closed community which is just thinking too much in the confines of Indian borders. Because fundamentally, people who are practicing our ideology are spread all across the globe. They are everywhere. They may not even know that they are basically practicing a very similar ideology, but they are our people. So fundamentally, I don't want us to be guarded and bordered off. I want connections. I want us to be connected. And if you really think about it, Dharmic traditions have respect the divine feminine. And a lot of the troubles which we often hear about in the world is an effect of the tension between this false idea of self and false idea of culture and the feminine. Essentially, what is it that we are trying to aim through this organization? We aim to vocalize certain reminders that may trigger conversations and reflections. And we also aim to give a public voice to the private thought and conversations that people may be having in the confines of their own bubbles. Now, see, continuing on what was being talked about earlier with respect to the Holocaust and the Jewish community, and even other things that have been mentioned, there's often a bias which is voiced when certain uncomfortable incidents are mentioned. Why is it coming? Where is it coming from? Is it just because people end up thinking that we're going too much in the history and not in the present? But that's not true. We have a memory so that we don't repeat the same troubles again. So why I don't want us to be an organization that just glorifies the past and thinks too much about the history is because I want to find solutions for today and tomorrow, not just yesterday. If you really think about it, and why I also don't want us to be just specified to Indian territory is because there's a lot to learn from the people around us and the cultures around us. So, in my opinion, the story of the snake, right? The biblical snake, which influenced Eve to eat the forbidden apple. Now, that might look like a curse on a superficial level, but on a deeper level, it also reflects how additional layers and increased levels of development were triggered with the act of Eve eating that apple. As Genesis mentions, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, which means what essentially? Get a job, work, get out of your hermit mode, interact with the world, and through that experience, maybe leave an impact. Somewhere the rules of the reality around may have been changed, and I do feel that the times to just sit in the comforts of our homes and pretend we're still in a garden and not take relevant action which appeals to logic and factual context, that might not be a very sensible thing to do. This is a time when we should be taking action, interacting with people, connecting. And I, at some point, would totally like our organization to assist in creating more bridges across various cultures who have a dharmic root to them, who have a dharmic vibe to them, who are our people essentially. Right? So that's something that I aim to assist in. And yeah, that is why I was cautioning against.
I would just like to have some more clarity, Akash, for the sake of our audience. What exactly
Yeah,
do you mean by our people? How did you reach this? What are the common traits which you would define as being? What would you define as the traits which would make a conventionally non-Indic ethnic group as actually our brethren in philosophy and in dharma?
fair enough.
How do you reach this?
See, so the idea, the way to recognize it is very simple, as per my opinion and my understanding. There are two modes of operation in the reality of society around. One is the dominator culture, and the other is a partnership model, the collaborative one. In my understanding, the dharmic traditions approach and adopt a very collaborative partnership model. They are not of the dominator culture. So the cultures and the communities which are practicing a collaborative partnership approach, they are our people. So that's my opinion of it.
Exceptionally well said and quite succinct and beautiful, I would say. I'll hand over the mic to our wonderful presenter.
Thank you, Akash. As Vikram said, very well said. And even I agree that Hinduism is often referred to as more of a way of living than a religion. So, with the times changing around us, our understanding of Hinduism, our understanding of the dharma that flows from it also needs to be changed, also needs to adapt to it. With that, we close the discussions for today. I hope our audience has gotten some perspective on what this organization stands for, more on what it seeks to achieve, and more on how it seeks to achieve in our next episode. Stay tuned. We'll be back soon. And in the meanwhile, keep supporting us. We will need your support going forward so that the aims and objectives of this organization are met properly and with the intentions that they are supposed to. Thank you all, and thank you to all my panelists for joining me today.